Okay, well, thank you all. This is a talk that's in the year's theme of the peace testimony and what it means for us as Quakers and what we ought to do about it as Quakers. I want to give a trigger warning right up front that this is going to be a hard conversation. It will involve some disturbing content, and I can't help that. We're talking about war, after all. But I'm just, if it gets too much for you, I will certainly not take it personally. If you just can't deal with it, I'm not going to do this gratuitously, but there are certain things that I need to share which are important, I think. I also want to just be right up front about how I'm approaching this topic. This is a topic that, it looks like John's coming in now. This is a topic that many people work very long and hard on from many different perspectives. John, greetings. I had a great talk with John earlier in the week, or last week actually, because this is the area that he works in a great deal. And many people that are, right here in Washington particularly, are involved in conflict mitigation and conflict prevention and cleaning up after conflict and lots of diplomatic work, lots of aid work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all of which is really, really important, none of which I'm talking about today. I'm going for the full picture here. I'm actually looking at the deeper question of whether wars are always going to be here, and is there any way that we could stop that from happening categorically, change the paradigm? Just is that a possibility? Can we actually get to that place? So I will also say that I'm approaching this from an unapologetically feminist perspective. And that's feminist in the sense that I have a deep and abiding commitment to the equality of all persons. That's essentially how I would define feminism. And that's persons of all genders and all of the biological baggage that each gender brings to their existence in this world. So that's an important piece of this. I also come to this topic as an ethicist. That's my work. And so I'm looking for, in that work, I would look for values that motivate people to behave in certain ways, or that persuade them not to behave in certain ways. So I'm always looking for drivers of human behavior, where that comes from and how we might be able to, in some ways, get people to reflect and change that. I also, not surprisingly, approach this as a Quaker, and I'm very much moved by George Fox's words when he said, "I lived in the virtue of that life and power that took away the occasion for all wars." That's central to my approach, I think. And I'm also not at this time looking for, what you might call pragmatic, sort of incremental answers. I'm not talking about diplomatic protocols or new treaties or new this, that, or the others. I'm looking for a transformative, spirit-driven solution. That's my goal here. Okay, that's all my disclaimers. Now I'll start talking. I want to open basically with where I think we should open, and that is the reality of the consequences of war. That wars are unambiguously brutal, gory, appalling, grotesque, abhorrent. They include levels of suffering and pain that are almost incomprehensible to most people, and certainly morally unacceptable. Except for, the only sort of, and it's a big exception, despite all of that, there is a strong argument, and I'm to a considerable extent persuaded by it, of just wars. Those are wars that you are defending against an aggressor, not wars that you start. There's some room there for discussion, and I won't have a chance to get into that today, but that's the one sort of variation on what I'm going to be talking about today. I also want to, I don't know, it's something that we'll talk about when we get to the queries, but wars involve trauma. And that trauma for the warriors, for those involved in the combat, they bring back with them. And for those who lose people through wars and who are directly affected by wars, they are also dealing with trauma, arguably for the rest of their lives. This is not just a short-term, terrible, incident. This is something that really deeply changes a person's life. We have people in our own meeting who work on PTSD, and work with veterans. I'm thinking of Laney, for instance. This is a really big piece of the work. My own father was a U.S. Marine. He served in World War II and the Korean War. He would never talk about conflict. He would never talk about the war in any sense except, general anecdotes, never about the real experiences of what he went through as a Marine, except that it really bothered him. And literally on his deathbed, 3 hours before he died, he was so agonized by the reality that he might be going to hell for his experiences in Guadalcanal that he finally opened up to me and said, I just cannot carry this any longer. Part of what he was commanded to do at the end of the Guadalcanal campaign, he and his company, he was a captain, they were sent into these caves where the Japanese army had been holed out, an extensive cave network in Guadalcanal, to clean out any last soldiers that were there, any Japanese that were there. And, they used the tool of choice for that kind of an operation, that flamethrower. And they went into these caves and used that flamethrower. And he had kind of come to understand and I won't say peace, but to acceptance that, if you're going up against the combatant of the enemy, that's something you can reconcile with. But they went into one cave room, and as they went in with the flamethrowers going, and afterwards he discovered that the Japanese had put their women and children in that cave. And he was never able to find a way to come to any peace about that. 66 years later, he was still carrying that weight on his deathbed. And I offered whatever reassurances I could, as did the priest that was there with him. But it's unreconcilable, this kind of trauma. The damage is that deep. And, this is what we carry forward. And sometimes this is what we as Quakers have to help people to find some peace there. Another big observation I would have is that, and it's not a surprise, but war is embedded in our cultures. This is something, our Defense Department, we have great pride in our military people. My father later served as commandant of cadets at a military school that I was sent with. It was all considered an honorable thing. It's a great thing to have your little boys at that time, trained to be future military officers. That was like a good thing. And nobody questioned that. And to a large extent, nobody questions that right now. Another observation, and it's one that I'm familiar with more directly, and that is there are, as an ethicist, there's a brand of ethics called warrior ethics. And that's where ethicists in the military academies train future officers to deal with the moral weight of having to kill people, of basically knowing that you are going to be sent out and you're going to have to actually kill people. It's not necessarily, but probably that's part of the package. And there has to be some way that you can reconcile that as a defense against, aggressors to your homeland, saving your wife and children, or your husband and children, saving things that you value. There's got to be a way to be able to look in the mirror at night and to get on with your life. That's a course that you take at Annapolis and West Point. It's a big, important course. It's mandatory. And then the last just general observation is, this is not historical. This is going on right now. We're all living more so in many ways than we ever have before with the day-to-day latest reports from Ukraine. And then, of course, there are all these other wars that we don't get the reports on, from Yemen and Ethiopia, what's going on in the Eastern DRC and Syria, et cetera, all of which are brutal. They just strike many of us as just utter, total madness that they go on, and just how inappropriate they are to what we think of as any kind of decency or civilization right now. Okay, where I go differently than a lot of other people, but not all, there are more people like me, is to look at this as a product of evolution, of biology. And there's a whole biological evolutionary perspective that's formalized in this. And that is arguably saying that war is a product of our instincts. It's part of our biology. It's part of natural selection. It's built into our sex drive, quite literally. And it's, that's where this comes from. That's where it has its origins. And to a large extent, that's where it still is. Now, to take that apart a little bit, lots of animals are predators. That's just the nature of certain animals. Human beings are predators as well. And we're pretty good at it, better than any other animal at it. That predation is mostly in most animals just to get the next meal. But in some animals, and we're animals too, it's about procreation. It's about getting the mate and keeping competitors for that mate away. And it's concentrated on males. So many male animals will be the ones that will, basically go to battle one-on-one with another competitor for a mate. And we see that all the time in all the documentaries and all of that. Sometimes they kill each other. I mean, it happens, not always. But there's a very clear purpose in that. And, that's pretty much the end of it. They're not set out as gangs to have organized violence against each other, except, and you were expecting me to say humans, actually, except for chimpanzees, baboons, and humans. Chimpanzees and baboons do organize gangs of males who go and will attack other gangs of males from another group to limit competitors for mates. I have literally run into this quite physically. In Kenya, when I lived there, I was out hiking and I came upon a large band of baboons who all started throwing rocks at me. We were on a riverbed, a dry riverbed, and just two of us. And I picked up rocks and threw it back. And my throw was a lot more accurate than theirs. So after a while, they went away. But I mean, it's quite a thing to see a whole group. This case must have been 70 of them that just came out of the woods, and there they were. So that's a group action that's violent. It's driven in this case by good biological reasons. It's part of a reproductive strategy of males of those species and also of humans, going back to the time when human beings started to get organized in hierarchical structures. This is like 40,000 years ago, when we started to have agriculture, when we started to accumulate wealth, when we started to have, positions of high status. There was a real sense then that, this was part of largely the part of the reproductive strategy of those in power is to have that wealth, and part of the property that they acquired, and I'm very emphatic about this, part of the property were females, or in this case, women. Women were property. And I hate to say it, but in countries still around the world, women are property. This has not yet gone away. So, very valuable property for sure. But men collected property in terms of their status, their wealth, but also their women. So that was something that, you fight over property. It got to extremes in the late 1600s. There was a Moroccan sultan named Moulay Ismail bin Sharif. He was called the Bloodthirsty, so it kind of sets the tone. He had, to this date, the standing record for number of offspring, 888 offspring with over 500 concubines. He was very careful to count the number of offspring accurately. The concubines was an arbitrary number because it didn't really matter that much. Even today, we have some societies, many societies in the global south that are still polygamous. And polygamy is essentially capturing a limited resource and depriving others from that. It's a status thing. It's also built into cultures, but that's arguably where it comes from. The other really concerning observation, and I don't know if Michael, your wife, is there, but gender-based violence is almost exclusively a male domain. In fact, all violence is almost exclusively a male domain. That's just the way biology is. And it's to this day, nearly all in human societies, nearly all violent acts are carried out by men or boys. We don't usually talk about this. We don't usually talk about that in that level of accountability. We also don't often talk about what we would like men to do to be part of the solution to that biological trend. People like Mary and I have spent countless hours in meetings about gender-based violence where it's women talking to women about women and about what men do to women. And there are seldom a man in the room. And this just goes on and on and on. And I've been doing this work for 30 years and Mary probably longer. You can almost count the men on one hand who show up in those spaces. It's a tough space to be in. But all of this comes back to the point that men dominate. They still do. We still live in patriarchal societies. Men control power. Men control most wealth. Men control how wealth is spent. And to a very large extent, we see wealth spent on defense. We see huge budgets for defense, even more than the Department of Defense asks for in our country. We have clear evidence, though, in the few cases where countries are governed by women, without exception, the profile of public expenditures changes to emphasize much more expenditure on health and education and a clear decrease on expenditures on defense. The other side to this, and this is the grisly part, but it's real because it's not just historical. Well, it's historical in the sense of going back to World War II, which is where I've got the last really good data. But even in the Bosnian genocide, 50,000 plus rapes took place in the Bosnian genocide. In the Rwandan genocide, 250,000. And at the end of World War II, when the Russians came into Berlin, over 2 million German women were raped. And we don't talk about this very much. It just doesn't sort of come up right now. To this day, ISIS and Boko Haram emphatically say that that's part of what they're here to do. This is part of their strategy, one of their ways of carrying conflict forward. The 9/11 terrorists, they all went onto those airplanes knowing that Allah had put aside 72 virgins for them in the afterlife. That was their absolute conviction. I don't know what women get in the afterlife, but this again is this notion of men controlling wealth, property, decision-making, and women. And even in our own Bible, God tells Moses and the Israelites to go and kill all the boys and men of in this case, the Midianites, but keep the women who are virgins and only women who are virgins as their wives. Again, property. My argument is that in this day and age, it does not have to be that way. Humanity has a remarkable record of transcending our biological limits. We see it in science and medicine and technology. We regularly transcend our biology. We are able, were we to decide to do so, to control our instincts for violence to a large extent. We're capable of remarkable compassion and caring at a very large scale. I would just, call to mind the recent we saw in a football game, which is almost a ritual of violence. But in that football game with the Buffalo Bills a couple of weeks ago, one of their players, Damar Hamlin, had a cardiac arrest in the middle of a football game. And there was a remarkable outpouring of compassion and care for him by people all across this country. And we've seen lots of examples where something tragic happens in the world and people reach into their pockets and help out and do other things to be compassionate and caring. We can do that. And my last assertion and challenge to people is that we have to do that. It's not a question of if, it's a question now as our technology for warfare gets more and more advanced, as we see warfare moving into artificial intelligence, as we see the destructive power of our weaponry just be way more than what's needed to destroy humanity already. We have that time right now. It's an existential challenge to make that change happen. So that's my, I'm laying all this out for you. I know it's making men online here feel uncomfortable. I don't know what to say about that because it's not obviously not you. You wouldn't be here if you were that kind of a man. But how do we hold men accountable? But also, how do we hold women accountable to, we're all allowing this paradigm to continue. every one of us in some level is not challenging ourselves to transcend to that level, I think we have to. I think we have to own that hope. And particularly as Quakers, people of peace who are known for that, is basically to go big. It's time to change. It's time to change the nature of human beings. I think we can do it. I don't have the recipe. I don't know how that would look, but we have some amazing minds and spirits that could be put to that task, and just an entirely different conversation that could go forward. So I will stop there and just read aloud the 3 queries that I have, and then I will ask Michael to put them up on the chat. The first query is a question, basically. Have you ever been exposed to a sharing by others of a wartime trauma? If so, how have you responded? Or how would you respond were the sharing to happen to you? The second query, are there particular but different callings for Quaker men and Quaker women to advocate for changes in men's behavior regarding gender-based violence, and for many more women to be in senior decision-making roles? And third, should Quaker women be as accepting of the absence of the vast majority of men in the active, organized work to end gender-based violence and the oppression of women? This is my song, oh,